Cosell of NFL Films. You know that those podcasts usually get recorded on Thursday morning, but I figured since Lucas is out and Greg is very kind to adjust to my schedule, I figured we'd just bring him on the radio show and do a little bit of a live install. Greg, hope your holiday was good. Good to see you, bud.
Buck, I'm doing fine. During football season, it's like yesterday was Wednesday for me, That's the way it kind of works.
There is nothing that resonates more with me than something like that, because my family just utterly perplexed at the idea that I had to leave yesterday because there's practice again and they have a game on Sunday and all these different things.
Right.
Continue to spin. The wheels on the bus go round and round. It's football season, baby.
I mean, I actually did not see one snap of either game yesterday because I was actually working.
Well, that's an interesting way, because I know that you're a red zone guy on Sundays typically, and then you go back and peel through the tape that way. You did not obviously prepare anything for the NFL matchup show on these two games since the NFL matchup show.
But the Mahomes, I think, is fascinating, and the Chiefs are fascinating to me because of the way they've been spoken about all season. And I don't think people are aware that Mahomes has the most dropbacks in the NFL over the last 9 games. They are a passing football team. A lot of people have spent all season talking about the fact that they run the ball and, now that there's more balance in their offense and all that. But the fact is, they're a passing team. I think people think differently because we haven't seen 60-yard touchdown passes, which we were used to seeing, 3-4 years ago, certainly when they had Tyreek Hill. Now it's efficiency. Mahomes has become an incredibly efficient player. They've got the most dropbacks, but they lead the league in third down conversions. They're second in time of possession. We know that he makes, and I don't want to sound cliched, but there's really no other way to say it. We know that he makes plays in those critical high leverage moments, whether it's third down or more recently in the red zone. So it's really an offense that's fueled by Patrick Mahomes, and he's really just a terrific player.
Yeah, well, I don't want to spoil anything for you as you go back and watch these games perhaps later in the week, but he was every bit the Patrick Mahomes that we've come to expect yesterday against the Steelers. And Steelers not able to get any pressure on him, Greg, which has been the big thing. They've played the Texans and the Steelers in these last couple of days, and they've kept him pretty clean. They're not allowing any sacks up front right now, which, of course, if you give Patrick Mahomes that kind of time, he's going to kill you.
Yeah. And then, the other thing, too, is because of all these dropbacks and the fact that he's been so efficient, I mean, he's not thrown a pick, by the way, in the last 6 games, and he's second in the NFL to Jared Goff in passing yards in those games. So, just to reiterate, this is an offense that's clearly fueled by Patrick Mahomes. And, the great thing, too, is because they control the ball and they're second in time of possession, there's an effect on your whole team. We know that Steve Spagnuolo is really good, arguably the best D coordinator in the league. But when your offense controls the ball like that, your defense plays fewer snaps. And that is a stat that's not looked at very much, number of snaps a defense plays in a game. And over a course of a season, that really matters. I remember speaking years ago, I think it was Herm Edwards when he was coaching, and saying that in an ideal world, you would really like your defense to play between 60 and 64 snaps a game. If you start going above that too regularly, it really puts a burden on your defense.
Greg Cosell of NFL Films is here with us on 104.5 The Zone. You can subscribe to The Install, which normally shows up in your podcast feed every Thursday, but we figured we'd do a live episode today, and Greg is kind enough to accommodate. Greg, the Titans go to Indianapolis and they lose. They come back in the second half to make it a 1-score game, but obviously they got themselves down 38-7. Mason Rudolph started. We talked about the idea of from the standpoint of where they are, purely from a football standpoint, it didn't necessarily make sense to make the quarterback change at the time that they did. Now, obviously, we understand that there are mitigating circumstances there, and they plan to go with Mason Rudolph again, which reaffirms my position on why they're making this quarterback change, because they got to show something here in these next couple of weeks as far as the viability of everybody involved right now on a 3-12 football team. But I guess with Mason Rudolph, the objective was to keep the offense on time and on schedule. He threw one egregious pick, even though there was two more that he threw. What did you make of Mason Rudolph against this Indianapolis defense?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mason Rudolph played fine, relatively speaking. I mean, it's hard to play when you fall behind by so much. I mean, that's a difficult position for any quarterback, and certainly this team's not built to throw the ball. I mean, they ended up not throwing it that many times relative to the rest of the league. I think, did he have 34 attempts, something like that? It was right in that range, as I recall. I think really the bigger picture, and again, we don't know the answer to this. You may have a sense because you're there and I'm not, but assuming that this coaching staff is back, and then I never advocate for anybody to lose jobs. I don't do that,
Sure.
and nor do I know enough to know whether that should even be considered. But assuming this coaching staff is back, it strikes me that they've made the decision that Will Levis is not their answer going forward. Now, again, we can debate that. People can debate that. If that's the case, and it'll be interesting to see how teams evaluate this quarterback class. I think it's going to be all over the board with this quarterback class. I think there'll be some teams that could have a couple in the top 10, and I think there'll be other teams, because I've looked at all these guys, not from this year in 2024, obviously, Buck, because I'm doing NFL work now, but I've looked at all these guys from 2023 and some even going back to their 2022 tape. I think there'll be a lot of teams that don't view any of these quarterbacks as top 10 picks, but there'll be some that do. That's the nature of the scouting business. I don't know where the Titans stand on that. They may feel that they need to play another year with a stopgap quarterback, and who knows? It could be Mason Rudolph. Depending on, because he's on a 1-year deal, right?
Correct.
So I mean, who knows? I don't think he'll be in demand as a starter, and if the Titans make it clear that, hey, you could be the guy going forward, for a year anyway, he may say, hey, this is a great spot and I'm going to come back. But I think, again, just as an outsider, so to speak, because I'm not there in town and in their building, I just sense that this particular staff feels like Will Levis is not the answer.
Yes, I would 100% agree with that assessment. They haven't said anything to that effect publicly.
There's no reason for them to. There's
Correct.
no reason for them to.
But we can infer to a degree based on their actions. And just to add some context to what you're saying about this upcoming quarterback class, their preference would be, it feels like, to go with a veteran stopgap situation. But that depends on where they end up picking, Greg, right? This is all very fluid. April's a long, long way away, and we still have free agency before that. So to get ahead of ourselves in any way, shape, or form, obviously, is not productive. But there are some underlying thoughts on this in the building, and it's worth keeping an eye on how those things go from there. Without necessarily getting into, the Jags as the opponent, these are two teams in a very difficult spot. We've talked about what it takes to get after Mac Jones. It takes pressure, and that's not something that they necessarily had in the first meeting between these two teams. From your standpoint, with teams that and I know that you don't spend a ton of time, obviously not on the matchup show, with teams that are out of the running.
Sure.
But for a team like the Titans, from a tactical standpoint, maybe it's not even a tactical standpoint, what are you looking to see from them? Because obviously you and I are going to talk more about them as we move forward. With two games left to go, understanding the kind of personnel that they're prepared to deploy here.
Yeah, and I don't get caught up in because I don't know the answer and it's hard to tell from tape. I don't get caught up in whether guys are playing hard or, I assume that guys go out and they play. Yeah. They're professionals. I mean, this is what they do. Obviously, when you're playing for something, there's a human element as well. But unless a guy is clearly dogging it and it's evident, I don't get caught up in that because you just don't know. But I think, I think for me, when I watch, like for instance, when I watch the Titans D, because Murray got hurt, and who's the other linebacker who started with him who got hurt?
Otis Reese.
Otis Reese. So I was very anxious so I spent a lot of time on defense focusing on Cedric Gray and James Williams because you don't know where the future goes here. I mean, those are two draft choices. Gray, I think, was drafted with the idea that he could become a starting linebacker, particularly given the fact that he was a 3-year, highly productive player in college. So I watched, Gray and Williams fairly carefully. And I thought Gray, flashed. I thought he had some good moments. Williams is obviously making a position change, so he's seeing the game differently because he was a safety in college. And even though he played down in the box a decent amount, he's essentially a safety in college. So I spent a lot of time looking at those guys. I still spend a lot of time looking at Brownlee because I think he's got a chance to be a pretty good player. Whether he's an outside guy or a slot guy, I'm in my mind, I'm trying to figure that out. I know he's playing on the outside for the most part, and obviously McCreary, after missing a game, is back, so he's the slot corner. I obviously spent a lot of time looking at Sweat, who I think for the most part has had a very good season.
Yeah.
I think it's on the edge where they're probably going to look, to get better, because I think Key is he's a free agent too, correct?
No, he's under contract for one more year after this one. Yes,
one more year. Okay, I'm sure he'll be back.
They do have outs from his contract though, Greg, and they do actually have an out out of Harold Landry's contract, depending on how that goes.
Out of whose?
Landry's.
Oh, okay. So we'll see.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I look more at individual players at this point, not so much the tactics, because, obviously they're not involved in the playoff race, and I'm not looking ahead to see, hey, how are they going to play tactically or schematically? I spend more time at this point kind of looking at individual players.
Yeah, I know you touched on a lot of defensive points there, but just from what I was able to see going back and watching this game, and an untrained perspective, of course, but J.C. Latham looked like he had a pretty solid game, particularly in pass protection this past week against the Indianapolis Colts. Greg, we have talked just quickly, and then we'll move on to the rest of the games that are this weekend, because obviously there are some highly competitive ones that are worth breaking down. And of course, you can catch Greg not just here or on the install, but you can see him on the NFL Matchup Show on ESPN, which I assume is again on Saturday this week.
There will be two airings on Saturday morning this week, because there's 3 Saturday games, which all mean something. So they're all on the show. If we air on Saturday morning, we have to do the Saturday games. And the good thing, as I say, is they all mean something.
Right. So before we move on to those, you and I have talked about what the tape tells you about this offense. And let's just operate under the assumption that this coaching staff will, in fact, be back in 2025. And how Levis has Levis specifically not necessarily vibed with what they're trying to run offensively. And they've told you that based on the quarterback change that they felt necessary. I'm curious to know, because there's going to be a lot of dialogue around, like Caleb Williams, for example, and an offensive coordinator name that's going to be at the top of most people's list in Ben Johnson, who runs a very different kind of system for a very different kind of quarterback than, for example, Caleb Williams might be, based on the timing, based on the rhythm that they want out of that offense, keeping it on schedule, how well Goff does that in particular. And I'm wondering if it was just kind of a bad fit for Will Levis and Brian Callahan for the jump, given that Callahan wants to run that same kind of system and doesn't necessarily create these easy completions that you and I have talked about for a player like Will Levis, and again, that you have to have those answers for.
Yeah, one thing I learned, from a coach that was in the league for 40 years and is a really good friend of mine, he said that coaches coach what they know. And again, that doesn't make coaches bad, good, and different. I mean, every coach, has strengths and certain things they probably don't do as well as others. But your point is a good one. I think when I watch the tape, and I'm purely going by tape, again, I don't know how things are taught in the building, so I don't want to, I don't go there. But I think that your point about easy completions, like for instance, Ben Johnson with Goff, he doesn't run an offense because Goff's a certain kind of player and he's very good, where he just builds, simple throws in. He's very schematic in how he attacks at the intermediate and deeper levels. And he has a really good O-line. And don't forget, they have a really good run game as well. So they can line up and they can pound you in their run game. So their pass game tends to be very schematic in terms of what they do at the intermediate and deeper levels. Then there's other coaches that work more at the shorter level to create easy completions for the quarterback. And I think with Will Levis, to me, that's something that you really needed to do. And again, this is purely a tape comment. I don't think you saw quite enough of that within the Titans offense. I think Levis he always strikes me, because he's so high strung, as a guy that needs to feel good early in the game, that he needs to get completions. And even if they're 3 yards, he needs completions. And I thought that there were a lot of individual routes in this offense. And again, not 100%. I don't want people to think, or if a coach happens to be listening, that, oh yeah, we do these. Every coach does a lot of the same things. But I think overall, when I watched their tape, I always felt at times, not always, at times I would feel like, I don't think that these kinds of routes are helping Levis really see it cleanly and feel real comfortable delivering the football. So, again, don't forget where Callahan came from. He came from Joe Burrow. And Joe Burrow is a high level quarterback, and Joe Burrow is phenomenal at not only what he sees, but he's phenomenal with his ball location. And Will Levis needs work in that area. So there's a lot of one-on-ones that Burrow completes that Levis will not complete.
Yeah, I'm just trying to, obviously we'll do an autopsy of the season by the time we get around to finishing this thing off. But there's just some of these questions through our conversations have arisen, and I know the audience appreciates that perspective. On to the weekend of games that is ahead. I assume Broncos and Bengals is in the matchup show.
Yeah, that's a Saturday game. I think in our matchup room here, we're all kind of rooting for the Bengals because they're fun to watch on offense, but a lot of things have to happen for them to get in. But obviously, they have to beat the Broncos. They have to win their final two and then see what happens. Because I think they're low man on the totem pole as far as the Colts and the Dolphins. I think so a lot of things would have to happen for them to get in. But yeah, that game's in the show. Chargers, Patriots, even though the Patriots don't have a great record, the Chargers have to keep winning. They've become kind of a fun offense to watch because they're a little different. They play a lot out of base personnel, yet they go play action and they push the ball down the field. So they're kind of a little bit of an old school offense in that they don't spread you out necessarily. They line up with a lot of base personnel. They play Scott Matlock, who was a D end in college at Boise State, I believe, and he's become kind of their fullback. And then they have this kid Stone Smart, kind of a hybrid tight end wide receiver who's really become a bit of a factor in the last 3-4 weeks.
Excellent name, by the way.
I know, it's a great name, isn't it? Stone Smart.
There's some good ones every year in the league, certainly. I want to go back quickly to the Broncos, Greg, because from and I know you don't necessarily analyze teams through this prism, but from my standpoint, Denver has been one of the more surprising teams of the year. When you watch them on tape, specifically their offense, we know that they have a good defense as well, but given that Bo Nix was a draft pick and a lot of conversation had about how highly they drafted him, what's working there between Sean Payton and the personnel that they have, especially Bo Nix?
Yeah, I'd say there's a couple of things. Number one, you talk about giving a quarterback, some of those quote unquote easy completions. Payton's really good at that. Payton's really good at getting his quarterback comfortable. And the other thing that stood out about Nix, which I think has maybe surprised a lot of people, I'd probably say it surprised me as well, based on the fact that I did him in detail coming out of college, is his arm has shown to be a little bit livelier than I think a lot of us thought. Because the other thing that they have in their offense is they do have a lot of those in-breaking routes, those dig routes, sort of 18 to 22 yards, and he sticks the ball in there really, really well. But there's a lot of movement with him. There's a lot of boot action. They get him out of the pocket. They give him throws that are clean, defined by NFL standards. They're simple. They're chain-moving kind of throws. They don't have to be 20-yard gains. And therefore you get a quarterback feeling comfortable, feeling that, hey, I can complete balls. So when you do call that deep dig, or it does get to be 3rd and 8, you're not in that pressing mode of, man, I haven't completed many balls in this game, and now I got to try to stick in a dig ball, at 22 yards. So I think that Nix has really become more comfortable as the season has progressed, because their run game has not been that great. So it's really been more about Nix in their ability to move the football, where you need the pass game to be more of the sustaining element in many respects than the run game.
Eagles-Cowboys would be a different kind of a game. We're not certain right now of Jalen Hurts' availability, I assume,
right?
Given the concussion protocol situation. But from the Cowboys' perspective, I assume this game is in the matchup show, yes?
It's actually not, for the reason you mentioned, because the Cowboys have been eliminated, and unfortunately, because of the concussion protocol, which, as you know, that's at least 5 days. And even though this week we're shooting the show on Friday, we're not going to have an answer to that. And I just, we know they're in the playoffs, and I wasn't sure what to do with that game.
Yeah, no, I completely understand. That has to be the first time in history that Cowboys-Eagles hasn't been in the matchup show.
But it's funny, the Cowboys, it's almost a shame they've been eliminated, because they're a block punt away from being 5-0 in their last 5 games, or a punt botch, I guess, whatever you want to call that, from being 5-0 in their last 5. And, in watching their tape, particularly in offense, Cooper Rush is not a highly, high traits quarterback, but he's played pretty well. And last week in that Sunday night game against the Bucs blitzed him a lot and they tore it up, which is not just on, him, but the whole offense, but he did really well. And on third down, they dominated. He's been very decisive with the ball as he's gained more experience. And even though they didn't run well last week against the Bucs, prior to that game, Rico Dowdle was the second leading rusher in the previous 4-game stretch, only behind Saquon Barkley. So they've been able to run the ball. And their defense, playing with a lot of names that people might not recognize, has actually been playing pretty well in recent weeks.
He's Greg Cosell of NFL Films. You can follow him at Greg Cosell on Twitter. You can watch him on the NFL Matchup Show, 2 airings on Sunday morning, or you can set it on demand. You can watch it on ESPN Plus. However you want to get the best tape breakdown out there, make sure that you do it before this Sunday and Saturday slate. Buddy, thank you for being flexible on the schedule. Always good to see you, and I look forward to doing it again next week.
All right, Buck, appreciate it. Thanks so much.
That's our good buddy, Greg Cosell. Make sure you subscribe to the Install Podcast wherever it is that you get your podcasts. Some interesting stuff there on Callahan and Levis in particular, why it didn't work, and kind of parsing that out, because obviously that's going to be a big talking point heading into this offseason, depending on what this team does at quarterback. We'll circle back to that later in the noon hour. Jackson, do you have SEC observations?
Let's give it a shot.
They're next.